We've spent quite a while now looking at aggregate demand, looking at the components that make up aggregate demand and the factors that would cause each of them to change, making the aggregate demand curve shift. Now, the other kind of key aspect that we need before we start considering the overall macroeconomy is to consider the other side of the economy. So we've looked at demand, now we're going to look at supply. So again, we're using this word aggregate to separate this concept of aggregate supply from the microeconomic supply. Just a quick recap on the difference. And supply, as in the microeconomic concept of supply, that is referring to the supply of a particular product. So that's talking about the supply of coffee or the supply of cars, something like that. It's talking about the amount of a particular product which is being produced. Aggregate supply means the total amount of supply within the economy. So the total supply of all goods and services within the economy. Now, we're going to break this down a little bit further and think about it in terms of what's going on in the short run, which we're going to do first, and then after that, we're going to move on to look at the long run level of aggregate supply. The short and the long run, in terms of what we're considering here, the short run means that factor prices are constant. That's what makes it the short run when we're thinking about macroeconomics. So in the short run means that factor prices are constant. So what do we mean by factor prices? Well, the factor prices are what the firm has to pay in order to use factors of production. So what we're talking about there are wages, we're talking about the costs of capital, we're talking about the kind of the land costs and so on. All of those prices are remaining constant in the short run. So let's think a little bit about what will happen then. So if we start at a particular point, so let's just kind of for the sake of argument to pick a point here that we're going to start at. So this is our certain level of output. So our output level of Y1 when the price level is P1. So let's just think what would happen then if a firm wanted to increase, or firms generally wanted to increase output from Y1. So we want to move to the right essentially along this axis here. Well, if we want to move along here, then as we've said before, the factor prices are constant. So what the firms might well decide to do, rather than going out and employing new workers or building factories and those sorts of things, that those are quite time consuming and expensive. What they might well decide to do is just to try and get more essentially out of the workers that they've already got, and that might mean things like kind of overtime payments and so on, things like that. So what that will mean is that in order to increase their level of output, let's say to move up to Y2 here, what's going to happen is that the costs for the firms are likely to rise because they're working their existing factors harder, and as a result of that, then we would have another point that would be kind of approximately here. So what this is telling us is that if firms in general want to increase their output to Y2, then the price level in the economy will increase to P2, and that's a general trend. So what that means is that we can draw our short run aggregate supply curve as a line going through those 2 points and continuing like this, and it works the same way as well. If output were falling, then what they will try and do is they will just try and maybe kind of cut back on prices, something like that, to try and boost sales, and that would lead to the reduction in the price level that would work as a result of going kind of back the other way. So the short run aggregate supply curve, a few things to bear in mind. Firstly, it's normally drawn as a straight line. It's upward sloping, and technically it should be drawn slightly to the elastic side, as you can see there. That doesn't really matter kind of in the first year of your economics course if you were to draw it as a 45-degree line, but it's slightly more accurate if you draw it as an elastic curve like that. So that's the nature of the curve itself. The other thing that we need to think about then with short-run aggregate supply is the factors that will make this short-run aggregate supply line move. So when we think about the short-run aggregate supply curve, as we've said before, the initial assumption that we made was that factor prices remain constant. Now, essentially, what will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift is if those factor prices were to change in some way, or essentially what we're talking about here are things which are likely to alter the costs of production for firms within the economy. So if the costs of production within an economy change, then we would assume that just get rid of the S there. If the costs of production change, then we will assume that that the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift. So let's think about what the main costs of production for firms are likely to be. Well, one of the main things, obviously, that they're going to be thinking about is wages, how much they have to pay their workers. They're also going to have to think about the cost of their raw materials as part of their overall costs. Their productivity will also have an impact, because if they are more productive, then that means that that they should be able to produce at lower levels of cost. So this productivity I suppose, refers to the capital that they have in place in the business. And the last thing that we need to think about is the role of government to influence business costs through taxation. Now, these are the four things, essentially, which can influence the position of the short-run aggregate supply curve. And essentially what will happen is, if any of these costs of production rise, so if we get an increase in cost of production, then the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift left, because it will mean that the firms within the economy are going to be less willing to supply at the price level, because their costs have increased. So there's less profitability there for them to do so. So if we think about the wages, then this might be, for instance, if we were to think about there might be, for instance, a minimum wage which might affect. Remember, we're talking here about aggregate supply, so this has to be wages across the whole economy. It can't just be wages within a particular industry. It has to be something that influences very large proportions of the economy across the whole economy. So minimum wage would be a good example here. So if the minimum wage were to be increased, then that would increase the cost of production, as we've seen down here, and shift short-run aggregate supply to the left. So we would end up with a new short-run aggregate supply curve, which would be there if we were to see a situation where there was a minimum wage. And what that would mean is that at the same level of output, the price level will rise, because obviously the firms will now be paying their workers more than they were previously, and they will be passing some of that on as higher prices to the rest of the economy. Raw materials, some of the things that we might want to think about here are commodity prices. So we might well be affected by commodity prices changing on the global markets. And another really important factor here, and one that can get you some really good analysis and evaluation marks in exams, is to think about the impact of exchange rates on raw material costs, because exchange rates have a big impact on import prices within the economy. So if a currency were to weaken, then that would mean that anything imported would become more expensive. And given that the UK imports a lot of our raw materials, particularly a lot of our commodities, that means that actually the costs of production will rise. So for instance, when the pound devalues, particularly against the dollar, something like oil prices, the oil prices in the UK will rise, because it's becoming more expensive for us to buy that foreign oil. And when that happens, again, as we saw before, the costs of production for British businesses will rise, and short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left, as we can see in the diagram there. The third point then, productivity. This is all about how much output the businesses within an economy get from their capital. So this is the efficiency, I suppose, of the capital that we have within the economy. And if the efficiency, we'll just think about it the other way around this time, if the efficiency in the economy were to improve, if the productivity levels within the economy were to improve, then that would mean that firms would be able to produce at lower costs of production per unit, and that would mean that actually we would see this working the other way around. There would be a reduction in the average cost of production, and as a result of that, we would see short-run aggregate supply actually moving to the right like that. So under those circumstances, we would hopefully see that there would be a reduction in the price level at that same level of output. And finally then, the government also has a role to play, because some of the business's costs revolve around tax, so kind of corporation tax and so on, things like that. So if the government imposes higher levels of tax, then that will be an increase in the cost of production, and again, short-run aggregate supply will shift left. So to recap then quickly on short-run aggregate supply, it's an upward sloping straight line, and it shifts left and right depending on the costs of production for firms in general within that economy. And those can be caused by these four factors here: changing the wage levels within the economy, raw material costs for firms within the economy, productivity levels within the economy, and the level of taxation applied by government. If any of those change, then that will shift short-run aggregate supply. And if any of them change dramatically in a short period of time, then that will create what we call a supply-side shock, which will mean a big shift in short-run aggregate supply. In theory, it could be in either direction, but normally it's a shift left. It happens when costs rise very dramatically. The next video then is going to build on aggregate supply a bit further by talking about long-run aggregate supply.